Move to the back where you belong. These seats are for real passengers. The words cut through the first-class cabin of Premium Airlines Flight 847 like a blade through silk. Victoria Whitmore didn't whisper them. She didn't mumble them under her breath. She declared them with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. At exactly 7:30 p.m. EST on November 15, 2024, inside the cream leather sanctuary of first class at JFK Terminal 4, those 12 words would trigger the most expensive meltdown in aviation history. The woman saying them had no idea she was speaking to two men who could ground her flight with a single phone call. Before this story ends, someone's about to lose everything they thought money could protect. If you believe respect shouldn't depend on how you dress, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged by your appearance? Because what happens next proves that quiet power beats loud privilege every single time. The two men sitting in seats 1A and 1B didn't look like they belonged in first class. At least, that's what Victoria Whitmore thought as she stood in the aisle, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her diamond-encrusted watch. Cameron Blake, sitting by the window, wore a simple black hoodie and dark jeans. His twin brother Carson in the aisle seat was dressed identically. To anyone glancing their way, they looked like college students who had somehow wandered into the wrong section of the plane. They weren't college students. They were 34-year-old tech moguls worth more than most small countries' GDP. But Victoria Whitmore didn't know that. All she saw were two black men in hoodies sitting in what she considered her seats. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time, her voice dripping with the kind of entitled outrage that money can't buy but privilege can perfect. "These are our seats. Arthur and I always sit in row 1. Cameron looked up from his phone, his dark eyes meeting Victoria's ice-blue glare. His voice was calm, steady, the tone of a man who had learned long ago that volume doesn't equal power. "Ma'am, we're in our assigned seats. Perhaps you should check with the flight attendant about yours." Victoria's face flushed red beneath her expensive makeup. She turned toward the galley and snapped her fingers like she was summoning a servant. "Stewardess. Stewardess." "There's been a mistake." Sarah Martinez emerged from behind the curtain, her crisp uniform immaculate, her smile practiced and professional. She had been working for Premium Airlines for 3 years, and she knew exactly who Victoria Whitmore was. Victoria flew this route twice a month, always complained about something, and always got her way. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Whitmore?" Sarah asked, her voice respectful but tired. "Yes, there's a massive problem," Victoria said, pointing a jeweled finger at the Blake twins. "These people are in our seats. Arthur and I always sit in 1A and 1B. Move them to the back where they belong." The cabin fell silent. Other first-class passengers turned to watch. Phone cameras started appearing, held discreetly but recording everything. Sarah looked at the twins, then back at Victoria. This was the moment where training should have kicked in. This was the moment where she should have asked to see boarding passes, realized the twins were in their correct seats, and politely told Victoria to find her actual seat. But Sarah didn't do that. She looked at two young black men in hoodies and made a choice that would cost her career, her reputation, and her future in the airline industry. "Gentlemen?" Sarah said, her voice taking on that condescending tone reserved for people she assumed couldn't fight back. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" "You already checked them when we boarded," Carson said quietly. "You served us champagne. I need to verify them again." Sarah insisted, her hand extended. "There seems to be a booking error." Carson sighed, the sound of a man who had been through this dance before. He pulled out his phone and showed the digital boarding pass. Cameron did the same. Seat 1A, Cameron Blake. Seat 1B, Carson Blake. Premium first-class tickets paid in full. Sarah stared at the passes. They were valid. They were correct. but Victoria was breathing down her neck, and Sarah knew who paid the bills. "Mrs. Whitmore is a platinum-level member," Sarah said, as if that explained everything. "Perhaps we can move you gentlemen to seats 3A and 3B. They're also first-class seats." "No," Cameron said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that made the nearby passengers lean in closer. "We paid for these specific seats. We're staying in these seats." Victoria's voice rose to a shriek. "This is ridiculous. Look at them. They're obviously using staff upgrades or stolen credit cards. Real first-class passengers don't dress like that." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every passenger in first class heard them. Every phone camera captured them. And in that moment, Victoria Whitmore signed her own social death warrant. What she didn't know was that the two men she had just humiliated weren't just successful. They weren't just wealthy. They were about to become the most powerful passengers in aviation history. Cameron pulled out his phone again. Not to show his boarding pass this time. To make a call that would change everything. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Cameron and Carson Blake really were. The twins had been born 34 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Detroit, Michigan. Their mother, Gloria Blake, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after their father left when they were 5. She cleaned offices at night, worked retail during the day, and did freelance bookkeeping on weekends. Money was always tight. Christmas presents came from the dollar store. School clothes came from thrift shops. But Gloria Blake had one rule that she drilled into her sons from the moment they could understand words. Your circumstances don't define your potential. Your choices do. Cameron and Carson took that lesson to heart. While other kids were playing video games, they were learning to code on a donated computer that barely functioned. While their classmates were hanging out at the mall, they were in the library devouring books about business technology and finance. By 16, they had built their first app, a simple task management tool for students. It made them $500 more money than they had ever seen in one place. By 18, they had full scholarships to MIT. By 22, they had dropped out to start their first company. By 30, they were running Blake Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that protected everything from small businesses to government agencies. Their client list included the Department of Defense, the FBI, and half the Fortune 500. 3 weeks ago, they had closed their biggest deal yet, a $50 million contract to protect the nation's critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. The meeting had taken place in a windowless room in Washington, D.C., with men in dark suits who asked questions about digital warfare and national security. Today, they were flying to London to meet with European clients who wanted the same level of protection. It was supposed to be a quiet flight, a chance to rest and prepare for presentations that could expand their company internationally. Instead, they were sitting in first-class seats they had paid for with their own money, being told they didn't belong there by a woman who had never worked a day in her life. Victoria Whitmore was the kind of person who believed the world owed her something simply because she existed. Born into old money in Manhattan, she had married into even older money when she wed Arthur Whitmore, a real estate developer who owned half of Midtown. She had never earned $1 in her life, but she had spent millions of them. Her handbag cost more than most people made in a year. Her jewelry could have funded a small charity. Her sense of entitlement was worth more than both combined. Victoria believed that first class was her natural habitat, that people like the Blake twins were invading her space. She saw their hoodies and assumed poverty. She saw their skin color and assumed inferiority. She was about to learn that assumptions can be very expensive mistakes. Arthur Whitmore sat in seat 2A pretending to read a financial newspaper while his wife caused a scene. He had learned long ago that the path of least resistance was to let Victoria have her way. It was easier than fighting. It had always been easier than fighting. Arthur had built his fortune by reading people, by understanding power dynamics, by knowing when to push and when to yield. As he watched his wife berate 2 young men in hoodies, something in his experienced businessman's gut told him this was different. These weren't college kids or staff members or someone using a stolen credit card. These were men who sat with the kind of quiet confidence that came from real power, not inherited privilege. But Arthur said nothing. He had been saying nothing for 23 years of marriage. Sarah Martinez was 28 years old and had been working for Premium Airlines since she graduated college. She had hoped to travel the world, meet interesting people, maybe even save enough money to start her own travel business someday. Instead, she spent her days dealing with entitled passengers who treated her like a servant, demanding upgrades they didn't deserve and special treatment they hadn't earned. Sarah had grown up in a working-class family in Phoenix. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to college, working double shifts at factories to pay for her education. She knew what it was like to be judged by your appearance, to be assumed incompetent because of your last name or your accent. But she also knew that keeping wealthy passengers happy was how she kept her job. And Victoria Whitmore was the kind of passenger who could end careers with a single complaint to management. So, Sarah made a choice that thousands of service workers make every day. She chose job security over moral courage. She chose wrong. Captain Michael Thompson was in the cockpit running through his pre-flight checklist when the call came through on the intercom. Sarah's voice was tense, professional, but clearly stressed. "Captain Thompson, we have a situation in first class. Mrs. Whitmore is requesting that we reseat 2 passengers. There seems to be a dispute over seat assignments." Michael Thompson was 45 years old and had been flying for Premium Airlines for 15 years. He was 3 years away from retirement, 3 years away from a pension that would set him up for life. He had seen disputes like this before, and they always ended the same way. Whatever the high-value passenger wanted, the high-value passenger got. "Handle it quietly," he said into the intercom. "Whatever Mrs. Whitmore needs." It was a decision that would cost him everything. Co-pilot James Rodriguez was new to Premium Airlines, having transferred from a regional carrier just 6 months earlier. At 33, he was still learning the unwritten rules of commercial aviation. Keep the wealthy passengers happy, avoid confrontations, and never ever create problems for management. When he heard the captain's response to the first-class situation, he nodded approvingly. This was how things worked in the big leagues. Customer service meant giving important customers whatever they wanted. He had no idea he was about to become complicit in a discrimination case that would make international headlines. Back in first class, other passengers were starting to take notice. Margaret Foster, a retired teacher from Boston, had her phone out and was discreetly recording everything. She had seen enough workplace harassment in her 40-year career to recognize discrimination when she saw it. David Chen, a software engineer heading to London for a conference, was live tweeting the incident with the hashtag #RespectInTheSkies. His followers were already starting to share the posts. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon, was composing a detailed email to Premium Airlines customer service documenting every word she had witnessed. None of them knew they were about to become witnesses to a corporate meltdown of historic proportions. Carson Blake looked at his brother Cameron and saw something he recognized: the calm that came before the storm. They had been through this kind of discrimination before in boardrooms and restaurants, in exclusive clubs and upscale hotels. Usually they handled it quietly, privately, with a word to the right person or a discreet conversation with management. They had learned that making scenes rarely solved problems. But this was different. This was public. This was being recorded. And this was happening in front of other passengers who were watching to see how 2 successful black men would respond to being told they didn't belong. Cameron pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and found the number he needed. It was time to make a call that would remind everyone on Flight 847 that power doesn't always come with a title. Wealth doesn't always come with inherited privilege, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. As Cameron's finger hovered over the call button, Victoria Whitmore continued her tirade. Sarah Martinez continued enabling it, and Captain Thompson continued believing he was just managing another routine customer service issue. None of them had any idea that in 30 seconds, The entire balance of power on Flight 847 was about to shift. None of them knew they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. You know what Victoria Whitmore said, her voice rising to a pitch that could shatter crystal. I don't care what their tickets say. People like this don't belong in first class. They're probably using stolen credit cards or some kind of affirmative action program. The words hung in the recycled air of the cabin like toxic gas. Margaret Foster's hand tightened on her phone. David Chen stopped typing and stared. Dr. Rodriguez's mouth fell open in shock. Cameron Blake's finger stopped hovering over his phone and pressed the call button. Sarah Victoria continued, her voice now loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. I fly this airline twice a month. My husband's company does millions of dollars in business with your parent corporation. These people can sit in coach where they belong, or they can find another flight. Sarah Martinez felt sweat beading on her forehead. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but never one who was being so openly racist in front of a cabin full of witnesses. The smart thing would be to defuse the situation, to check seat assignments properly, to follow protocol. But Victoria Whitmore was glaring at her with the kind of fury that came with generational wealth and lifetime entitlement. And Sarah knew that wealthy passengers didn't just complain to management. They complained to ownership. Gentlemen, Sarah, said, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone that service workers use when they're about to deliver bad news. I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps if you'd be willing to move to seats 4A and 4B, I could offer you some additional amenities. No, Carson said, his voice quiet but firm. We paid for these seats. We're staying in these seats. Victoria's face turned a shade of red that clashed violently with her platinum jewelry. This is unacceptable. Arthur, do something? Arthur Whitmore looked up from his newspaper, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. Victoria, perhaps we should just take our actual seats. Absolutely not, Victoria shrieked. I refuse to sit behind them for 7 hours. Look at them, Arthur. They probably smell like... She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the cabin knew what she had been about to say. Margaret Foster had heard enough. Excuse me, she said loudly, standing up from her seat in row 3. Ma'am, these gentlemen were here first. They have valid tickets, and you're being completely inappropriate. Victoria whirled around to face this new challenger. Mind your own business, lady. This doesn't concern you. Racism concerns everyone, Margaret said firmly. And that's exactly what this is. Racism. Victoria laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. Don't be ridiculous. This is about standards. This is about maintaining the quality of service that first-class passengers expect. David Chen looked up from his phone. I've got the whole thing on video, he announced. This is already going viral. Victoria's eyes went wide. Delete that right now. You can't film me without permission, actually, Dr. Rodriguez interjected from her seat. We're in a public space. He can film whatever he wants. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Sarah Martinez knew it. She pressed the call button for the cockpit. Captain Thompson, we really need you up here. The situation is escalating. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson sighed heavily. Customer disputes were supposed to be handled by flight attendants. He was 3 years from retirement, and all he wanted was quiet flights and satisfied passengers. Rodriguez, you have the pre-flight. I'll be right back. Michael Thompson walked into the first-class cabin and immediately understood why his career was about to end. He could feel the tension in the air, could see phones recording, could sense the viral moment happening in real time. But he was old school. He believed in hierarchy. Wealthy passengers got priority treatment because wealthy passengers kept airlines in business. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in command. I'm Captain Thompson. Let's resolve this quickly and quietly. Cameron Blake looked up at the captain and saw everything he needed to see. This wasn't a man interested in justice or fairness. This was a company man who would prioritize profit over principle. Captain Cameron said calmly, "We have valid tickets for seats 1A and 1B. We've been seated for 15 minutes without incident. This woman is demanding we move because she doesn't think we belong here." Thompson looked at Victoria, then at the twins. He made the same calculation Sarah had made, the same assumption that would cost him everything. "Gentlemen, I understand your position, but Mrs. Whitmore is a valued customer. Perhaps we could find you some comparable seats." "No," Cameron said again. "We're staying here." Victoria clapped her hands together like a child getting her way. Finally, someone with sense. "Captain, I want them removed from this flight entirely. They're being disruptive." Thompson's jaw tightened. He had dealt with unruly passengers before, but he had never had to physically remove paying customers from their correctly assigned seats. Still, he knew which side his bread was buttered on. "Sir," he said to Cameron, "I'm going to ask you one more time to voluntarily move to different seats. If you refuse, I'll have to call airport security." The cabin fell completely silent. This was it? This was the moment that would define everything that came next. Margaret Foster held her phone steady, recording every word. David Chen's live tweet thread had already been retweeted 500 times. Dr. Rodriguez was taking detailed notes in her phone. Other passengers from coach had started to gather at the first-class curtain drawn by the raised voices and obvious confrontation. Cameron Blake looked at his twin brother. Carson gave an almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Cameron pressed the call button on his phone. On the other end, a voice answered immediately. "Blake Tech Solutions Emergency Line. This is Cameron Blake. Authentication code 77 Alpha Delta. I need an immediate conference call with David Crawford Premium Airlines CEO and General Peterson at DHS." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Stand by, Mr. Blake. Connecting now." Victoria Whitmore was still talking, still demanding, still assuming she had won. Captain Thompson was reaching for his radio to call airport security. Sarah Martinez was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. None of them were paying attention to the phone call that was about to change everything. "Mr. Blake." The voice on the phone was crisp, professional, and immediately recognizable to anyone who followed aviation news. "This is David Crawford, Premium Airlines CEO. I have General Peterson from Homeland Security on the line. What's the nature of your emergency?" Cameron put the phone on speaker. His voice was calm, professional, and loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "Mr. Crawford, General Peterson. I'm currently on Premium Airlines Flight 847 at JFK scheduled for London. My brother and I are being threatened with removal from our paid first-class seats by your captain because a passenger has complained that we don't look like we belong in first class." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Whitmore's mouth fell open. Captain Thompson went pale. Sarah Martinez actually took a step backward. Mr. Blake David Crawford's voice came through the speaker, tense and horrified. "Can you repeat that? Your flight crew is threatening to call security to remove 2 black passengers from their correctly assigned seats because a white passenger doesn't think we belong in first class. The entire incident has been recorded and is currently going viral on social media." General Peterson's voice cut in sharp and military precise. "Captain Thompson, this is General Peterson, Department of Homeland Security. You will stand down immediately. The Blake brothers are federal contractors with Alpha-level security clearance. Any interference with their travel could be considered a matter of national security." The color drained completely from Thompson's face. "Sir, we were just trying to—" "You were discriminating against passengers?" Crawford's voice snapped through the speaker. "Mr. Blake, on behalf of Premium Airlines, I offer my complete apology. Captain Thompson, you are relieved of duty immediately. Ms. Martinez, you are terminated effective now. Security will escort you both from the aircraft." Victoria Whitmore finally found her voice. "Wait, what? Who are these people I demand to speak to someone in charge?" Cameron looked at her calmly. Ma'am, you just did. You're speaking to the CEO of the airline and a Department of Homeland Security general. You demanded to know who we are. We're Cameron and Carson Blake of Blake Tech Solutions. We provide cybersecurity for the federal government. We also happen to own a significant stake in Meridian Holdings Premium Airlines parent company. The revelation hit the cabin like a physical blow. Margaret Foster actually gasped out loud. David Chen's fingers flew over his phone keyboard. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. Victoria Whitmore staggered backward, bumping into her husband's seat. That's impossible. You're Black men in hoodies, Carson said quietly. Yes, we are. We're also your company's shareholders. We're also the people you just spent 20 minutes trying to humiliate based on our appearance. Arthur Whitmore buried his face in his hands. 23 years in business had taught him to recognize power when he saw it, and he had just watched his wife declare war on some of the most powerful men in America. David Crawford's voice cut through the stunned silence. Mr. Blake, what would you like us to do? Cameron looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at him. Fear, shame, shock, and, in Margaret Foster's case, fierce pride. We'd like to fly to London, he said simply, in the seats we paid for, without further harassment. Done, Crawford said immediately. Captain Rodriguez, you're now acting captain. A new flight crew is being dispatched to replace the terminated staff. Mr. Blake, your flight will be delayed approximately 30 minutes while we sort this out. Cameron ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The first-class cabin was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Victoria Whitmore was still standing in the aisle, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor that had already failed. Her face was white beneath her makeup and her hands were visibly shaking. You can't do this, she whispered. Arthur has connections. We have lawyers. You can't just... Ma'am, Cameron said gently. We just did. The silence in the first-class cabin stretched like a held breath. Victoria Whitmore stood frozen in the aisle, her perfectly manicured world crumbling around her designer shoes. Captain Thompson stared at the Blake twins as if they had just materialized from another dimension. Sarah Martinez was the first to move, reaching for her bag with trembling hands. I need to collect my things, she stammered. No, Cameron said quietly. You need to understand what just happened here. He stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding from the leather seat like controlled power. Carson remained seated, but his presence was equally commanding. Ms. Martinez. Cameron continued his voice, carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms and government briefings. In the last 20 minutes, you made a series of choices. You chose to believe that 2 black men in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class. You chose to enable discrimination rather than do your job professionally. You chose to humiliate paying customers to appease someone who was behaving badly. Sarah's face crumpled. I was just trying to handle a difficult situation. By assuming we were the problem, Carson interjected from his seat. Not the woman screaming racial epithets, not the passenger making unreasonable demands. Us. Because of how we look. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward from her seat. Ma'am, I heard everything. You never once asked to see Mrs. Whitmore's boarding pass. You automatically assumed these gentlemen were in the wrong. David Chen looked up from his phone. This is already at 50,000 retweets. Flight discrimination is trending. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. You planned this. This is some kind of setup. Cameron turned to face her fully. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone in the cabin had to lean in to hear him. Ma'am, we didn't plan anything. We bought tickets, boarded a plane, and sat in our assigned seats. You planned to have us removed because you don't believe people who look like us deserve to sit where you sit. That's not... I never said... You said we belonged in the back, Carson said calmly. You said we weren't real passengers. You said people like us don't fly first class. You suggested we were using stolen credit cards. Would you like me to continue? Margaret Foster stood up from her seat, her teacher's instincts kicking in. Young lady, she said to Victoria, I've been listening to excuses from entitled students for 40 years. What you did was inexcusable and everyone here witnessed it. Arthur Whitmore finally looked up from his newspaper. His face was gray and his hands shook slightly as he folded the pages. Victoria, stop talking. Please. Don't you tell me to stop talking, Victoria snapped, whirling on her husband. We're the victims here. We're being persecuted for having standards. The words hit the cabin like a slap. Even Arthur winced. Cameron pulled out his phone again. Since you seem to believe you're the victim here, let me show you what victimization actually looks like. He scrolled through his emails until he found what he was looking for. This is from last month. Blake Tech Solutions was hired to investigate a cybersecurity breach at a major hospital. During our initial meeting, the hospital administrator spent 10 minutes trying to find the real consultants. He assumed we were there to fix the computers, not secure the network. He scrolled to another message. This is from 3 weeks ago. We were presenting our proposal for the Department of Defense contract. A general actually asked if we were the translators for the real presenters. Carson took over. 2 months ago, we were staying at a 5-star hotel in Manhattan. Security was called because someone reported suspicious individuals in the penthouse suite. We were kicked out of the pool because another guest complained that we were making her uncomfortable. Every week, Cameron continued, we face exactly what happened here today. People see our skin color and make assumptions about our intelligence, our success, our right to exist in certain spaces. Victoria's face was flushed again, but this time with embarrassment rather than anger. I don't see color. I was just... You were just what Dr. Rodriguez interrupted. Protecting first class from black people. Because that's exactly what you did. The cabin's intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new acting captain, James Rodriguez. We apologize for the delay, but we're currently waiting for replacement crew members to arrive. We should be boarding the remainder of our passengers shortly. Margaret Foster looked around the cabin. Good. Those passengers need to hear what happened here. They need to understand what discrimination looks like. David Chen was still typing furiously on his phone. The story's been picked up by CNN, Fox, and BBC. There's already a hashtag movement calling for airline industry reform. Victoria grabbed Arthur's arm. Do something. Call your lawyer. This is defamation. Arthur pulled his arm away gently but firmly. Victoria, I've been in business for 30 years. I know when I'm looking at real power, and I know when someone has just made a catastrophic mistake. You embarrassed these gentlemen, you embarrassed me, and you embarrassed yourself. Our lawyers can't fix this. Cameron's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smiled slightly. That was our publicist. Blake Tech Solutions stock is up 8% on the news. Apparently, investors appreciate seeing leadership that handles discrimination with grace rather than retaliation. Retaliation? Victoria sputtered. You got people fired. Carson stood up to join his brother. Ma'am, we didn't get anyone fired. Your behavior got people fired. Captain Thompson chose to threaten us rather than do his job. Ms. Martinez chose discrimination over professionalism. Those were their choices, not ours. But you could have just moved seats, Victoria said desperately. You could have avoided all this. Could have. Cameron nodded. But why should we? We paid for these seats. We had every right to these seats. Moving would have told you that your behavior was acceptable. It would have told everyone watching that loud privilege beats quiet dignity. Margaret Foster clapped slowly. Exactly. How many times have good people stayed silent to avoid confrontation? How many times have victims moved aside to keep the peace? Dr. Rodriguez nodded. In my hospital, I see the results of that kind of thinking every day. Patients who don't advocate for themselves because they don't want to cause trouble. It leads to worse outcomes always. The cabin door opened and 3 new flight attendants entered, led by a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes and a professional bearing. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Maria Santos, your new lead flight attendant. On behalf of Premium Airlines, I want to personally apologize for the delay and any inconvenience you've experienced. She walked directly to Cameron and Carson. Mr. Blake. Mr. Blake. I'm here to ensure that your flight to London is everything it should be. Is there anything you need right now? Cameron smiled genuinely for the first time since boarding. Just professional service, Ms. Santos. The same service you'd give any passenger. You'll have that and more, Maria promised. She turned to address the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be boarding the remainder of our passengers shortly. I want everyone to know that discrimination of any kind is not tolerated on Premium Airlines flights. Every passenger deserves respect and dignity regardless of their appearance, background, or seat assignment. Victoria made one last desperate attempt. This is all being blown out of proportion. I was just trying to sit in my usual seats. It's not about race, it's about tradition. Carson looked at her with something that might have been pity. Ma'am, tradition is just peer pressure from the dead. The tradition you're defending is the tradition of judging people by their skin color instead of their character. Arthur Whitmore stood up slowly. Victoria, we need to go. Now. Go! She shrieked. Go where? These are our seats. Arthur pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. No, Victoria. These are our seats. He held up boarding passes for seats 2C and 2D. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Margaret Foster shook her head in disgust. So you knew the whole time that you were in the wrong seats? Arthur nodded miserably. Victoria always demands the bulkhead. She usually gets it because the staff knows her and they want to avoid scenes. I tried to tell her quietly that our seats were in row 2, but you let her humiliate these men anyway, Dr. Rodriguez said coldly. David Chen looked up from his phone. Sir, your wife's behavior has been viewed by over 2 million people in the last hour. Your real estate company's website is being flooded with negative reviews. Arthur's face went white. What Whitmore properties? David confirmed. People are calling for boycotts. Your company stock is down 12% in after-hours trading. Victoria grabbed Arthur's phone to see for herself. Her face went through several color changes as she scrolled through the social media responses. Racist landlord married to racist wife, she read aloud. Boycott Whitmore properties. Housing discrimination investigation needed. Arthur, they're destroying us. Cameron watched the couple's panic with detached interest. Ma'am, nobody destroyed you. Your words destroyed you. Your behavior destroyed you. Social media just made sure everyone could see it happen. Maria Santos returned with a tablet in her hand. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I need to inform you that Premium Airlines is conducting a full investigation into this incident. We'll need your contact information for follow-up. Victoria looked around the cabin desperately. This isn't fair. We're victims too. We're being cyberbullied. Margaret Foster had heard enough. Ma'am, you are not the victim. You spent 20 minutes trying to humiliate 2 men based on their race. You're facing the consequences of your own actions. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. In medicine, we have a saying, first do no harm. You chose to do harm. These gentlemen chose to respond with dignity. The intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin general boarding. Thank you for your patience. As economy passengers began filtering past the first-class cabin, they could see the tension, the phones, the obvious aftermath of some kind of incident. Whispered conversations started immediately. Did you see the video? That's them? The guys from Twitter. Those are the twins who exposed that racist lady. Victoria heard the whispers and shrank lower in her seat. Arthur stared at his phone, watching his company's reputation crater in real time. Cameron and Carson remained calm, professional, treating the situation like any other business crisis they had navigated. They had dealt with hostile corporate takeovers, congressional hearings, and Department of Defense briefings. One entitled Socialites Meltdown was manageable. Maria Santos approached them again. Mr. Blake, our CEO. Mr. Crawford wanted me to give you his direct number. He'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss how we can prevent incidents like this in the future. Cameron took the card. We'll consider it. Right now, we just want to get to London. Of course. Can I get you anything else? Different seats, perhaps. We could move you to our premium suite section. Carson shook his head. We're staying right here. These are our seats. This is where we belong. The simple statement carried weight that everyone in the cabin understood. It wasn't just about airplane seats. It was about the right to exist in any space without having to justify that existence. Victoria made one final attempt to salvage her dignity. You know, in Europe, people will understand. Americans are so sensitive about everything. Europeans have real class consciousness. Margaret Foster actually laughed out loud. Ma'am, you're about to find out that racism isn't any more acceptable in London than it is in New York. She was right. David Chen's live updates had already been picked up by British media. The story was trending in London, Paris, and Berlin. By the time Flight 847 landed, the Blake twins would be international symbols of dignity in the face of discrimination. But Victoria Whitmore would be something else entirely. As the last economy passengers boarded and found their seats, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The immediate confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Cameron looked out the window at the lights of JFK, then at his brother. They had handled the situation exactly as their mother had taught them, with intelligence, dignity, and unshakable confidence in their own worth. They had won more than just the right to keep their seats. They had won something much more valuable, the respect of everyone who witnessed how they chose to fight. And Victoria Whitmore had lost something much more expensive than money: her reputation, her social standing, and her comfortable position at the top of a world that was rapidly changing around her. The plane pushed back from the gate carrying its passengers toward London. But for some of them, the journey would end very differently than they had planned. As Flight 847 lifted off from JFK, the real fallout was just beginning. David Crawford, CEO of Premium Airlines, was in his Manhattan office at 9:30 p.m., frantically working phones while his crisis management team assembled around a conference table. How bad is it? Crawford asked his head of communications, Janet Walsh. Janet looked up from her laptop, her face grim. Sir, we're at 15 million views across all platforms. The hashtag Respect in the Skies is trending globally. We're getting calls from CNN, BBC, 60 Minutes, and The View. Someone leaked audio of your conversation with the Blake brothers. Crawford's jaw tightened. What kind of audio? Everything. The whole phone call where you fired Thompson and Martinez. The twins asking for you and General Peterson. All of it. It's been edited into a 3-minute video that makes us look exactly as bad as we are. Crawford's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. That's the chairman of the board. This is going to be a very long night. Meanwhile, in the air above the Atlantic, the atmosphere in first class had shifted dramatically. Maria Santos and her crew were providing exceptional service, going out of their way to ensure every passenger felt comfortable and respected. Margaret Foster had moved to the empty seat next to Carson, engaging him in conversation about his company and the importance of standing up to discrimination. Dr. Rodriguez was discussing cybersecurity in healthcare with Cameron. David Chen was documenting the changed atmosphere, contrasting it with the earlier hostility. Victoria Whitmore sat in sullen silence, scrolling through her phone with increasing horror. The social media response was unlike anything she had ever experienced. "Look at this," she whispered to Arthur, showing him her phone. "Someone found our address. They're posting photos of our building. They're calling me the first-class Karen and you the enabler husband." Arthur was reading his own phone, his face growing grayer by the minute. "Victoria, we have bigger problems. 3 of our major clients just sent emails asking for emergency meetings. The Hamptons Country Club is reviewing our membership status. Your charity board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your position." Victoria's voice rose to a whisper shriek. "This is insane. All I did was ask for my usual seats." "No," Arthur said firmly, surprising everyone within earshot. "What you did was humiliate 2 successful men because they're black. What you did was turn our family into a symbol of everything wrong with entitled privilege. What you did was destroy 30 years of reputation building in 30 minutes. It was the first time in their marriage that Arthur had directly contradicted his wife in public. The shock on Victoria's face was visible from 3 rows away. Cameron, overhearing the conversation, turned slightly in his seat. "Mr. Whitmore, you seem like a reasonable man. Why didn't you stop this before it escalated?" Arthur looked up his face, showing the exhaustion of a man confronting uncomfortable truths. "Because I've been taking the path of least resistance for 23 years. Because it was easier to let Victoria have her way than to have difficult conversations. Because I'm a coward." The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. Victoria stared at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. "Arthur, you can't mean that." "I can and I do," Arthur said quietly. "I've watched you treat service workers badly for years. I've listened to you make comments about people who don't look like us. I've enabled behavior that I knew was wrong because confronting it would have meant confronting you." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Whitmore, that kind of honesty is the beginning of change. It's never too late to choose differently." Margaret Foster nodded. "In my teaching career, I've seen bullies and I've seen enablers. The bullies cause immediate harm, but the enablers allow it to continue. Both have to change for real progress to happen." Cameron's phone buzzed with a call from David Crawford again. He put it on speaker with the CEO's permission. "Mr. Blake, I wanted to update you personally. We've terminated not just the flight crew, but also the gate supervisor who allowed Mrs. Whitmore to board without checking her seat assignment. We're implementing new training protocols immediately." "What kind of training?" Carson asked. "Unconscious bias training for all customer-facing staff. De-escalation techniques that don't involve automatically siding with aggressive customers. And clear protocols for handling discrimination complaints that prioritize passenger rights over customer preferences." Victoria couldn't help herself. "What about our rights?" "We're customers too." Crawford's voice came through clearly. "Ma'am, you have the right to fly with dignity and respect. You do not have the right to discriminate against other passengers. Those aren't the same thing." Margaret Foster actually clapped. "Excellent response, Mr. Crawford." Cameron continued the conversation. "Mr. Crawford, we appreciate the immediate action, but we're interested in deeper changes. This incident highlights problems that go beyond one flight crew." "We're listening," Crawford said immediately. Carson pulled out his tablet and began reading from notes they had prepared during the flight. "Industry-wide airline staff receive minimal training on handling discrimination. Customer service policies often prioritize appeasement over equality. There's no standardized reporting structure for bias incidents. We'd like to propose a partnership," Cameron added. "Blake Tech Solutions specializes in ethical auditing. We can analyze your policy's training materials and incident reports to identify patterns of discriminatory treatment." Crawford didn't hesitate. Consider it approved. What would you need full access to your training protocols, complaint databases, and customer service policies? We'll provide a comprehensive analysis and recommendations for improvement, Carson said. Dr. Rodriguez looked impressed. You're turning this incident into positive change for everyone. David Chen looked up from his phone. This conversation is going to make great follow-up content. People love seeing problems turned into solutions. Victoria was frantically whispering to Arthur. They're taking over the airline. This is getting completely out of control. Arthur shook his head. Victoria, they're making the airline better. They're ensuring that what happened to them doesn't happen to other people. That's called leadership. Maria Santos approached with an update. Gentlemen, we're about 2 hours out from London. The captain wanted me to let you know that we've received clearance for priority landing. Customs has been notified that you're federal contractors, so your processing should be expedited. That's not necessary, Cameron said. We're happy to go through normal procedures. Sir, it's not about special treatment. It's about treating you the way you should have been treated from the beginning. Margaret Foster smiled. There's a difference between earned respect and demanded privilege. These men earned respect through their actions and accomplishments. Victoria was still scrolling through social media, her horror growing. Arthur, look at this. Someone created a Wikipedia page about me. Victoria Whitmore, born 1971, known for racist incident on Premium Airlines Flight 847. That's what I'll be remembered for. Then change the story, Dr. Rodriguez suggested. Use this as a learning experience. Acknowledge what you did wrong, show genuine growth, contribute to solutions. I don't need to learn anything, Victoria snapped. I'm not a racist. I was just having a bad day. The cabin fell silent. Even Arthur shook his head sadly. Cameron turned to face Victoria directly. Ma'am, respectfully, that statement proves you haven't learned anything. Racism isn't just burning crosses and white hoods. It's assuming that black people don't belong in first class. It's believing that your comfort matters more than other people's dignity. Carson added, it's thinking that being polite while discriminating makes the discrimination acceptable. Margaret Foster leaned forward. Young lady, I've taught teenagers for 40 years. The ones who grew up to be good humans were the ones who could admit when they were wrong. The ones who made excuses for bad behavior stayed stuck in those patterns forever. Arthur looked at his wife with something that might have been hope. Victoria, this could be a turning point. You could use this experience to become a better person. Victoria's response revealed everything about her character. I don't want to become a better person. I want this to go away. I want people to stop talking about it. I want things to go back to the way they were. The admission was devastating in its honesty. She wasn't sorry for her behavior. She was sorry for the consequences. Cameron and Carson exchanged a look that communicated volumes. This was exactly the kind of privileged thinking they fought against every day in boardrooms and government meetings. David Chen's phone buzzed with breaking news alerts. Oh, this is interesting, Mrs. Whitmore. 3 of your husband's business partners just issued public statements distancing themselves from discriminatory behavior and outdated attitudes. Arthur looked at the messages on his own phone and quietly began calculating the financial damage. Contracts canceled, partnerships dissolved, reputation destroyed. Victoria's 30-minute tantrum was going to cost them millions. The intercom crackled with the captain's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into London Heathrow. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing. As the plane descended through the clouds, Cameron reflected on the journey. They had boarded in New York as successful but private businessmen. They would land in London as symbols of dignity in the face of discrimination. More importantly, they had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for positive change. Blake Tech Solutions would now be consulting on airline industry reform. Their partnership with Premium Airlines could become a model for other companies. Victoria Whitmore, meanwhile, would land as one of the most infamous passengers in aviation history. Her name would be forever associated with entitled racism and the consequences of public discrimination. But that was her choice, just as their response had been theirs. Carson looked out the window at the lights of London approaching. "You know what the best part of this is?" "What's that?" Cameron asked. "We get to keep our seats." The simple statement carried profound meaning. They had fought for more than just first-class accommodation. They had fought for the principle that respect shouldn't depend on appearance, that dignity shouldn't require justification, and that equality wasn't negotiable. As the wheels touched down at Heathrow, they had won that fight completely. Within 24 hours of Flight 847's landing at Heathrow, the corporate casualties began mounting like dominoes in an earthquake. Captain Michael Thompson sat in his empty Staten Island apartment staring at a severance package that wouldn't cover his mortgage for more than 3 months. 15 years of perfect service records meant nothing now. His pension was frozen pending a Federal Aviation Administration investigation into discriminatory practices. "I was just following customer service protocols," he told his wife Linda over the phone. She was visiting her sister in Florida, supposedly for a week, but Thompson suspected she might not be coming back. Mike Linda said, her voice tired. "I watched the video." Everyone watched the video. Those men weren't causing trouble. You chose to threaten them to make a racist passenger happy. Thompson ended the call and opened his laptop. Job search websites for commercial pilots all carried the same basic question. Have you ever been terminated for cause? His career in aviation was over. Sarah Martinez had it worse. At 28, she had fewer savings and no pension to lose. Her termination from Premium Airlines included a notation of discriminatory conduct which effectively blacklisted her from the entire airline industry. She sat in her Phoenix apartment scrolling through social media comments about herself. Someone had found her high school yearbook photos. Her former classmates were posting on her Facebook page expressing shock and disappointment. "I'm not a racist," she wrote in a long Instagram post that she deleted and rewrote 12 times. "I was just trying to handle a difficult customer situation. I made a mistake in judgment, but it wasn't about race." The post received 3 847 comments in 2 hours. Only 17 were supportive. Her mother called from Tucson. "Mija, what happened up there? The whole family is asking me questions I can't answer." Sarah tried to explain about difficult passengers and company policies, but the words sounded hollow even to herself. She had seen the video like everyone else. She could hear her own voice making assumptions about the Blake twins based on their appearance. The truth was becoming clear. She had discriminated, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Victoria and Arthur Whitmore's world was crumbling with spectacular efficiency. Their flight landed at Heathrow to find British media waiting in the terminal. Someone had leaked their passenger manifest. "Mrs. Whitmore." Mrs. Whitmore shouted a reporter from The Guardian. "Do you have any comment about your behavior on Flight 847? Victoria pulled her designer scarf over her face and tried to push through the crowd. Arthur attempted damage control. "We're consulting with legal counsel," he said diplomatically. No comment at this time, but the damage was already expanding beyond social media shame. While they were in the air, Whitmore Properties' largest client, a pension fund managing teacher retirements, had issued a public statement. "We cannot continue our relationship with companies whose leadership demonstrates discriminatory attitudes toward the communities our members serve," the statement read. "Effective immediately, we are terminating all contracts with Whitmore Properties." That single announcement triggered a cascade of cancellations. By the time the Whitmores reached their London hotel, Arthur had lost 40% of his business portfolio. Victoria's social consequences were equally devastating. The Beacon Hill Country Club had called an emergency board meeting. Her membership was revoked by unanimous vote. The Whitney Museum removed her from their patron list. 3 charities asked her to resign from their boards. "This is insane," she told Arthur as they sat in their $800 per night hotel suite, scrolling through endless negative coverage. I'm being destroyed over one conversation." Arthur looked at his wife with a mixture of sadness and clarity he had never felt before. "Victoria, it wasn't one conversation. It was a pattern of behavior that finally got recorded. It was 30 years of treating people badly because you thought you could get away with it. The financial implications were staggering. Arthur's company was hemorrhaging contracts. Their Manhattan apartment building had protesters outside. The Hampton house was being vandalized. Their net worth was dropping by millions per day. But the personal cost was higher. Their daughter Madison called from Stanford crying, "Mom, my friends won't talk to me. My sorority is having meetings about distancing from problematic families. I can't show my face on campus." "How could you do this?" Victoria tried to explain, to justify, to minimize. Madison hung up. Their son Arthur Jr., working at Goldman Sachs, sent a text message. "Dad HR wants to meet with me tomorrow. They're concerned about reputational risk to the firm. I might lose my job because of what Mom did." The cascade of consequences was relentless and accelerating. Back in London, Cameron and Carson Blake were experiencing a very different kind of attention. Their hotel, the Savoy, had upgraded them to the Royal Suite without being asked. The concierge personally ensured their every need was met. Mr. Blake, the hotel manager said during a private meeting, "We want you to know that the Savoy has always prided itself on treating every guest with equal respect and dignity. Your experience on Flight 847 is exactly the kind of discrimination we work to prevent." Cameron smiled. "We appreciate that. Honestly, we just want to complete our business meetings and return home without incident." Their client meetings were becoming victory laps. European companies were eager to associate with Blake Tech Solutions, seeing the twins as symbols of grace under pressure and principled leadership. "Your handling of that situation," said Klaus Weber, CEO of a major German technology firm, "showed exactly the kind of character we want in our cybersecurity partners. If you can handle racist passengers with that kind of dignity, you can certainly handle digital threats with professionalism." The Blake twins' business was booming. Their stock price had increased 34% since the incident. New client inquiries were flooding in from around the world. But they weren't celebrating. During a quiet dinner at their hotel, Carson raised the bigger picture. "You realize what this means?" he asked his brother. "That standing up to discrimination pays off more than that. We're proof that the old systems are breaking down. 30 years ago, Victoria Whitmore would have gotten her way. We would have been removed from that flight, and nobody would have cared. Social media and camera phones have changed the power balance." Cameron nodded. "But we were also lucky. We had the resources to fight back. We owned stock in the airline. We had government connections. What about the passengers who don't have those advantages?" It was a sobering thought. Their victory was meaningful, but it was also the result of privilege, even if it was earned privilege rather than inherited privilege. They decided to use their platform responsibly. The next morning, they held a press conference at the American Embassy in London. British media packed the room along with representatives from major American networks broadcasting live. "We want to be clear," Cameron began, "that what happened to us on Flight 847 wasn't unique. Discrimination in travel hospitality and customer service happens every day to people who don't have the resources or platform to fight back." Carson continued, "We're announcing the Blake Foundation dedicated to providing legal and financial support to victims of discrimination who can't afford to seek justice on their own. We're also expanding our consulting work," Cameron added, "to help companies identify and eliminate discriminatory practices before they become public relations disasters." The press conference was carried live around the world. The message was clear: their victory wasn't just personal, it was the beginning of a broader movement for change. Meanwhile, Premium Airlines was implementing emergency reforms. David Crawford had assigned his entire executive team to develop new policies and training programs. "I want a complete overhaul," he told his staff. customer service protocols that prioritize fairness over appeasement, training programs that teach staff to handle difficult passengers without discriminating against other passengers, and a zero-tolerance policy for bias in any form. The industry was watching. Other airlines began preemptively updating their own policies, not wanting to face the same kind of public relations catastrophe. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new guidelines requiring bias training for all commercial airline personnel. Congress scheduled hearings on discrimination in air travel. Victoria Whitmore's 30-minute tantrum had triggered industry-wide reform. But for Victoria herself, the consequences kept multiplying. Her book club expelled her. Her tennis club revoked her membership. Former friends stopped returning her calls. She hired a crisis management firm for $50,000 per month, but their advice was brutal. The only way to rehabilitate your reputation is through genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and sustained charitable work. You need to show real change, not just public relations spin. Victoria fired them after one meeting. She wasn't interested in becoming a better person. She wanted her old life back, and she was learning that some damage can't be undone. Arthur, meanwhile, was quietly consulting with divorce attorneys. 23 years of enabling his wife's behavior had cost him his business, his reputation, and his relationship with his children. The price of staying silent had finally become too high to pay. As the first week ended, the contrast was stark. The Blake twins were building on their moment of injustice to create lasting positive change. Victoria Whitmore was discovering that privilege without character is a house of cards in a hurricane. The consequences were only beginning. 3 months after Flight 847, the changes were visible everywhere. Premium Airlines had become the industry leader in anti-discrimination training. Their new protocols, developed in partnership with Blake Tech Solutions, were being adopted by airlines worldwide. Customer satisfaction scores had increased 23% as passengers responded positively to staff who were trained to treat everyone with consistent respect. David Crawford stood before the International Air Transport Association in Geneva, presenting the Premium Airlines model to executives from around the globe. The Blake incident taught us that doing the right thing isn't just morally correct, he explained to the packed auditorium. It's good business. Our stock price is at an all-time high. Customer complaints are down 67%, and we've had 0 discrimination incidents since implementing our new training. In the audience, representatives from Lufthansa, British Airways, and Delta took careful notes. The Premium Airlines approach was becoming the gold standard, Crawford continued. The key insight is that customer service doesn't mean giving every customer everything they want. It means treating every customer with professional respect while maintaining consistent policies for everyone. The Blake Foundation had processed over 400 cases of travel discrimination in its first 3 months. Their legal team had won settlements totaling $2.3 million for victims who previously had no recourse. Cameron Blake spoke at Harvard Business School about the intersection of business success and social responsibility. People often assume that standing up to discrimination will hurt your career, he told the MBA students. In our experience, the opposite is true. Companies want to work with partners who demonstrate character under pressure. Carson was testifying before a House Transportation Subcommittee about discrimination in commercial aviation. The technology exists to record these incidents, he told the congressman. The legal framework exists to address them. What was missing was the will to act. That's changing. The twins had leveraged their moment of humiliation into a platform for change that was affecting millions of travelers. But the human cost of that change was playing out very differently for different people. Michael Thompson had moved to Florida, where he was working as a flight instructor at a small regional airport. The pay was 1/3 of what he had made as a commercial pilot, and the work was far less prestigious. I learned something important, he told a reporter from Aviation Week who was writing a follow-up story. I spent 15 years thinking that keeping wealthy passengers happy was my job. I forgot that treating all passengers fairly was my duty. Thompson had used his severance pay to enroll in business ethics courses. He was slowly rebuilding his career with a better understanding of leadership and moral courage. Would I handle it differently now? He reflected. Absolutely. I would have asked to see Mrs. Whitmore's boarding pass. I would have verified seat assignments before taking any action. I would have treated the Blake twins with the respect they deserved from the beginning. Sarah Martinez had taken a job at a Phoenix hotel working in guest services for half her former airline salary. The position came with a notation that she was on probationary status due to her previous termination, but she was trying to learn from her mistakes. I enrolled in a community college course on cultural competency, she told her manager during a quarterly review. I'm also volunteering with a local organization that provides services to immigrant families. I want to understand how my assumptions about people affected my judgment. Her manager, Rosa Gutierrez, was cautiously optimistic. Sarah, what matters now is what you do going forward. You made a serious mistake, but you're taking responsibility and working to improve. That's more than many people do. Sarah had written letters of apology to the Blake twins, though she hadn't sent them. Her therapist suggested that the letters were more for her own healing than for the people she had wronged. I realize now that I was so focused on avoiding conflict with an aggressive customer that I created conflict with innocent passengers, she wrote in her journal. I need to find the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. The transformation was slow and painful, but it was genuine. Victoria Whitmore's story was very different. She and Arthur were in the middle of divorce proceedings. The financial settlement was brutal. Victoria would receive far less than she expected because Arthur's business losses were directly attributable to her behavior. The prenup includes a clause about conduct that damages the family's reputation, Arthur's lawyer explained. Mrs. Whitmore's actions on Flight 847 clearly qualify as reputation-damaging conduct. Victoria had hired 3 different crisis management firms, each promising to rehabilitate her image for increasingly expensive fees. None had succeeded. The problem, explained her latest consultant, is that authentic rehabilitation requires genuine remorse and consistent behavior change. You're not interested in either of those things. You want the consequences to disappear without acknowledging that your actions were wrong. Victoria fired that consultant too. She had moved into a smaller apartment in Queens, a dramatic come-down from her Manhattan penthouse. Her social circle had evaporated completely. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her children had largely cut contact. Madison had changed her last name at school and was considering transferring to a different university. Arthur Jr. had been encouraged to find employment elsewhere and was now working for a much smaller firm. Mom Madison said during one of their rare phone calls, "I can't understand why you won't just apologize. Just say you were wrong and try to make things right." "I shouldn't have to apologize for having standards," Victoria replied, still clinging to her warped justification. Madison hung up. That was their last conversation. Victoria spent her days reading social media comments about herself becoming increasingly bitter and isolated. She had started a blog called The Real Story, where she claimed to be the victim of a woke mob and accused the Blake twins of orchestrating a setup. The blog had 17 regular readers. Her fall from social prominence to complete irrelevance was swift and absolute. She had become a cautionary tale whispered about in the same circles that once welcomed her. Meanwhile, Arthur was quietly rebuilding his life and career. He had sold his remaining real estate holdings and was working as a consultant for affordable housing development, trying to use his experience for positive social impact. "I enabled discrimination for 23 years, he told a reporter from the New York Times, who was writing about executives who changed careers after personal reckonings. I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I chose comfort over courage. I'm trying to spend the rest of my career making up for that." Arthur had reached out to the Blake Foundation, offering his expertise in real estate development for their expansion into housing discrimination cases. They accepted his help, noting that genuine remorse and action were rare enough to deserve support. The Blake twins continued building their expanded platform. Blake Tech Solutions had opened offices in London, Berlin, and Tokyo, with each location specializing in helping companies identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. Their work went beyond consulting. They were funding research into bias in artificial intelligence, supporting minority-owned businesses through venture capital investments, and speaking at universities about leadership and ethics. The incident on Flight 847 was just the beginning, Cameron explained during a TED Talk that was viewed 4.7 million times. Real change happens when people choose to act differently in everyday situations, when they speak up instead of staying silent, when they choose principle over convenience. Carson had written a book titled Quiet Power: How Dignity Defeats Discrimination that became a bestseller in business leadership categories. The proceeds were donated to organizations fighting bias in hiring, lending, and public accommodations. Their mother, Gloria, now retired from her 3 jobs, attended every speaking engagement and interview. "I always told my boys that their circumstances wouldn't define their potential," she said proudly. "But I never imagined they would use their success to help so many other people." The ripple effects continued spreading. Airlines reported a 78% decrease in discrimination complaints as staff became more aware of bias and passengers became more confident about reporting inappropriate behavior. The Federal Aviation Administration's new bias training requirements had been extended to all transportation sectors. Buses, trains, and taxis were implementing similar protocols. Law schools were teaching the Flight 847 case as an example of how social media and public accountability could drive corporate reform faster than traditional legal processes. Most importantly, ordinary passengers were reporting that they felt more comfortable traveling, knowing that discriminatory treatment would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. The Blake twins had transformed their moment of humiliation into a movement for change that affected millions of people, but they remained focused on the future rather than the past. "We don't want to be known as the guys who were discriminated against on an airplane," Carson explained during a joint interview. "We want to be known as the people who used that experience to make travel more fair and dignified for everyone." The real victory, Cameron added, isn't that we kept our seats. It's that other passengers won't have to fight for theirs. 6 months after Flight 847, the transformation was complete. The Blake twins had built a legacy of positive change from a moment of injustice. Premium Airlines had become an industry leader in ethical treatment of passengers. Thousands of travelers were benefiting from improved policies and training. And Victoria Whitmore. She had become exactly what she feared most: irrelevant. The lesson was clear. Character matters. Choices have consequences. And in an age of social media and instant accountability, privilege without principle is a liability that no amount of money can protect. 1 year later, Cameron and Carson Blake were back on a Premium Airlines flight, same route, same seats, 1A and 1B. But everything else had changed. Maria Santos, now promoted to Regional Director of Customer Experience, personally greeted them at the gate. Mr. Blake, welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you flying with us again." The service was exceptional, but not because they were celebrities or shareholders. It was exceptional because Premium Airlines had trained every staff member to provide that level of service to every passenger. As they settled into their familiar seats, Cameron noticed a young black woman in business attire being welcomed warmly by the flight crew. No questions about her ticket validity. No assumptions about her right to be there. Just professional, respectful service. "That's why we did this," he said quietly to his brother. Carson nodded, watching a Hispanic family with small children being helped to their seats with patience and kindness. She won't have to fight for respect. Her children will grow up expecting to be treated with dignity. The flight was smooth, efficient, and utterly normal. Which was exactly the point. During the meal service, Cameron's phone buzzed with a text from their mother. "Watching your interview on CNN. So proud of my boys for choosing grace over revenge." Love, Mom. They had appeared on CNN's anniversary special about Flight 847, reflecting on how the incident had changed the travel industry. The segment ended with footage of Premium Airlines' new training center, where every employee learned about bias, dignity, and the importance of treating all passengers with equal respect. Dr. Rodriguez, the pediatric surgeon who had witnessed the original incident, was now on the Blake Foundation's medical advisory board, helping them address discrimination in healthcare settings. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, had become a volunteer trainer for the foundation, teaching bias recognition to service industry workers. Even David Chen, the software engineer who had live-tweeted the incident, was working with Blake Tech Solutions on a new app that allowed travelers to report discrimination incidents in real time. The community of witnesses had become a community of advocates. As the plane descended toward JFK, Carson reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. You know what the most important lesson was. What's that? We didn't have to choose between dignity and success. We thought standing up might hurt our business, but it actually made us more successful. Integrity doesn't cost you opportunities. It attracts the right ones. Cameron smiled. And we learned that individual moments of courage can create change. One phone call, one decision to stand our ground, one choice to respond with grace instead of anger. It rippled out to affect millions of people. The plane touched down at JFK, completing the circle. They were back where it all started, but they were different men in a different world. As they gathered their bags and prepared to leave, Maria Santos made one final announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude our flight today, I want to remind everyone that respect and dignity aren't amenities. They're standards. Every passenger deserves to be treated with courtesy and professionalism, regardless of their appearance, background, or destination. Thank you for flying Premium Airlines, where every seat is a first-class seat when it comes to human dignity. The passengers applauded spontaneously. Not for the Blake twins, but for the idea that fairness and respect had become the norm rather than the exception. Walking through JFK Terminal 4, they passed a wall display showcasing Premium Airlines' commitment to equality and inclusion. A photo from their original press conference was prominently featured with the caption, "When passengers stand up for what's right, airlines rise to meet the standard." Cameron and Carson exchanged a look and smiled. They hadn't set out to change an industry. They had simply refused to accept discrimination as the price of peace. "The next flight we take?" Carson said as they reached the exit. "I want it to be boring. Just two guys in hoodies sitting in seats they paid for, treated like every other passenger." "Exactly." They walked out into the New York evening knowing that tomorrow there would be other flights, other passengers, and other opportunities for people to choose between character and convenience. But tonight they could rest knowing they had made the right choice. They hadn't won by shouting louder or fighting harder. They had won by standing firm in their dignity and responding to hatred with grace. Most importantly, they had proven that justice doesn't require revenge, that change doesn't require anger, and that the most powerful response to discrimination is simply being who you are and refusing to accept less than you deserve. In the end, Victoria Whitmore had been right about one thing: there were standards to maintain. But those standards weren't about keeping certain people out of first class. They were about ensuring that everyone was treated with first-class dignity. Cameron and Carson Blake had helped the world understand the difference, and that made all the difference in the world. If this story moved you, I want you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this need to be told, and your subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear them. Second, give this video a like to show that you believe in treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or dress. And third, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up for what's right isn't just the moral choice. It's the choice that creates real change in the world. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed discrimination or been discriminated against yourself? How did you handle it? Your story could inspire someone else to find their courage. Because sometimes It only takes one person standing up to change everything. The Blake twins proved that quiet strength defeats loud prejudice every single time. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of justice, dignity, and the power of doing what's right. Until next time, remember your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable, and sometimes the person sitting next to you might just be the one who changes the world.